The Fast and the Furious from 2001 is one of my favorite films of all time, and I honestly think that it's a bit underrated. I think it's genuinely a really good movie. The Fast and the Furious franchise is criticized, and most of it is pretty well deserved, but the first film just really nails what the franchise should have been, I think. Things are still over the top, but nowhere near where they are today in the franchise, and I think there's just enough cheese in the writing that it's just so perfect. And what I mean by that is that I think all action movies kind of need a little bit of cheese unless you're going like the John Wick route. And even that has a little bit of cheese and things are a little over the top because that's kind of how you sell good action in this state of movies where we've sort of done everything. But I think the cheese has to be tasteful, and Fast and the Furious does it so well by being so quotable. And while that's definitely a bit of an unorthodox gauge of whether or not the writing of a movie is good, I think in a movie like Fast and the Furious, being quotable really helps. For starters, it makes people want to watch the movie again if there's a lot of quotable, interesting, funny, cheesy lines. And there are just genuinely so many good quotable lines in this. I am constantly quoting this and annoying everyone in my life with it. Here's just a quick montage of some of my favorite moments that I very regularly reference.
I like the tuna here.
Bullshit, asshole. No one likes a tuna here.
Man, he was in my face.
I'm in your face.
Just can't climb in the ring with Ali because you think you box?
What are you smiling about?
Dude, I almost had you.
You almost had me? It don't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Winning's winning. You can have any brew you want, as long as it's a Corona. I live my life a quarter mile at a time.
This fool's running a Honda 2000.
And while some people might say that's a criticism of the film, of being so cheesy that it becomes this like meme of quotability and reference, but for me, that's one of the biggest things I love about movies is referencing them and using them in my day-to-day life. It's fun, and this is a fun movie and should have stayed a fun franchise. And while I'm talking about the writing, well, it is pretty surface level. We actually do get some good, interesting character introductions and some decent character development. Watching Brian's character throughout this film is really interesting the first time you watch it. It starts as he's new to town and wants to enter the street racing scene, and then we quickly discover that he's actually undercover working with the FBI trying to take down these organized criminals busting trucks. And on that note, the character development of Brian, along with the dynamic he has with Dom, is really interesting and honestly pretty intense. Starting with Dom not really being the biggest fan of Brian, but then letting Brian in his good graces once he saves him from the cop chase, all the way to the last scene when he finally figures out that Brian is a cop and has been undercover this entire time trying to take down Dom and his crew. All the way up until the final moments when Brian finally gives Dom a 10-second car, and we don't really know where their relationship is going to go from there moving forward. Other than those two characters though, there's really not much to be said with the characters here so far in the franchise. We get introductions to everybody and they all have their kind of quirks and whatnot, but it's pretty much just a street racing crew gone truck heister crew. Let's move on from talking about the writing a little bit though. I want to talk about the cinematography. And right off the bat, it's definitely not great to say the least. But there are a few shots in this film that just have absolutely no business being as cool as they are. And while there are those few times the cinematography really shines, it's the final chase scene truck heist that really pulls me out of the movie every single time I watch it. For whatever reason, the scene starts in a shot day for night scene where it is clearly like 2 p.m. sun is out and they're trying to make it look like before dawn. It definitely looks really bad, but luckily they bring us out of that and just let it be daylight very shortly into the scene. Also, for what it's worth, I think a lot of the racing scenes are well done and everything feels pretty intense. And on that note, I really like the lack of music in most of those scenes. I think it really adds to the intensity of things, makes things feel more real, not to mention enhancing the sounds of the cars themselves, which is kind of the entire point of the movie. And on that note of sound, while there's a lack of music that's welcomed, the music that is in the movie is really good. I actually had this soundtrack on CD and listened to it a ton as a kid. And back to the note of production a little bit, I really like the parallel scene when Brian is getting ready to raid the trans house, as well as Dom's crew getting ready for race wars, and then we see all of that come to fruition pretty much at the same time, is really well done and something we will see moving forward in a lot of the other Fast and the Furious movies. I, probably like many of you, was always under the impression that this was a street racing movie first, and what followed with the franchise was completely different than that. But in watching this movie for this video, I realized that there are so many nuggets of what would become of this franchise in the first movie, to the point where I don't think anything happened on accident. While there is more street racing in this movie than basically any other Fast and the Furious movie, at its core, it's an organized crime investigation movie. And while the stunts and everything that happens in this movie is way more believable and played down a lot more, it pretty much is the beginning of what has now become the Fast and the Furious franchise. Where I always thought it just kind of happened out of nowhere, there was definitely signs from the very first movie. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this movie and I've seen it so many times, but I fully understand that you could absolutely rip this movie apart, and at its core, from a more objective film kind of lens, it's definitely not great. But I think it's also a lesson in there are so many things that can make a movie good, and sometimes it's not even why the filmmakers wanted it to be good that it makes a movie enjoyable to watch. But I also think it's cheesy on purpose, especially when you consider the franchise today. I think it was always meant to not be taken super seriously. And if you watch Fast and the Furious in that lens of just wanting to have a good time, get some really quotable lines, have a goof and a gab, heist some trucks, and save some lives, well then, boy goody, it's a really good time to watch. It's easily my favorite action film starring Vin Diesel and Paul Walker that released in 2001 about street racing and truck heisting, to say the least. No, but for real, The Fast and the Furious is easily one of my favorite movies. I watched it so much as a kid and still watch it a lot as an adult. It's just genuinely such a fun time to watch. It's definitely a comfort movie for me. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I quote it all the time, and I love it. It's just a great movie for me. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, do the right thing, good vibes only, and never stop creating.